The one quiet decision that saved Apple, the garage, the comeback, and the playbook. By the end of this story, you'll know the single quiet decision in 1997 that turned Apple from a near-bankrupt underdog, a simple choice that most people never saw coming. And it changed the company's destiny. Keep that in mind as we rewind to the Scrappy days when two friends and a third partner decided to bet the rent money on a homemade computer. The founders and the garage energy. Apple begins with a friendship and a mismatch that somehow worked. Steve Wozniak, a gentle hardware savant who could make chips dance. Steve Jobs, a persuasive storyteller who could make crowds lean forward before a product even existed. They weren't equals in temperament, but they were perfectly aligned in ambition. On April 1st, 1976, they formed Apple with a third partner, Ronald Wayne, and immediately started doing what great founders do, selling what didn't quite exist yet and building fast enough to catch up to their own pitch. The Apple I wasn't a polished machine, it was a board. The buyer brought the case, the keyboard, the monitor, and the patience. Yet it worked because it gave hobbyists something pure, direct access to computing without gatekeepers. The hustle was real. Jobs sold his old Volkswagen microbus. Wozniak let go of his prized HP calculator. It wasn't romantic, it was capital. And when the first orders landed, the pair learned the first hard truth of hardware companies. Success isn't the moment you get the order, it's the moment you deliver what you promised, and your customer comes back for a second unit. The Apple II and the first real moat. The Apple II in 1977 is where the myth begins to look like a business. This was the computer you could put on a desk without apologizing for it. A friendlier case, color graphics, a path for expansions. Schools began buying them. Small businesses quietly built their operations around them. For a while, the company was less a tech insurgent and more an office appliance that people actually liked. The product market fit wasn't just speed or specs. It was the feeling that a non-engineer could become powerful with a machine. If you want to understand Apple's early playbook, it's here. Make the hard things simple. Put the mess behind the curtain. Give users a tool that flatters their ambition. And then, crucially, keep the experience consistent. That consistency became a kind of promise between Apple and its customers. Break the promise and you lose them for a decade. Lisa, Macintosh, and the taste for risk. By the early 1980s, Apple had money, momentum, and a problem named IBM. The PC market was exploding, and the standard was hardening around Intel chips and Microsoft software. Apple chose a harder road, build the whole experience top to bottom, and win on user delight. Lisa arrived in 1983 with a graphical interface that looked like the future. It was also expensive and slow. The world shrugged. Then came the 1984 Macintosh, smaller, bolder, and wrapped in a Super Bowl ad that permanently altered how tech launches felt. The Mac wasn't just a computer, it was an attitude in beige plastic. Here's my take. The Mac was a creative revolution sold as a machine. It turned design from a nice-to-have into the main event and made pointing and clicking feel like you were playing a tiny orchestra with your hand. But revenue revolutions and creative revolutions don't always arrive on the same day, and inside Apple, the tension built. The CEO Steve Jobs hired John Sculley, valued discipline and predictability in a way Jobs didn't. The power struggle ended with Jobs leaving in 1985. If this were a movie, we'd cut to a sad montage set to synth music. Instead, reality did something better. It gave Jobs the space to sharpen the very instincts that would save Apple later. Exile, Pixar, and NeXT, seeds of the return. When Jobs left, he didn't exactly take a vacation. He founded NeXT to build the computer he always wanted for universities and researchers, a black box workstation with serious horsepower, and an operating system that felt like the future. In parallel, he acquired the outfit that would become Pixar, proving that storytelling wasn't just a keynote trick. It could create entire worlds and billion-dollar franchises. Meanwhile, Apple drifted. Product lines multiplied. Focus scattered. Competitors learned to copy what mattered and undercut what didn't. This is the part of the story where markets don't punish you right away. They wait until you're comfortable, then they hand you the bill. My view on NeXT's importance is simple. NeXT wasn't just a company, it was a lab where Jobs rediscovered the value of constraints. That operating system, that development environment, those design rules, they would later become the spine of modern Apple software. And constraint, handled well, isn't a limit. It's a tuning fork that helps you find the true note of a product. The comeback setup, 1997, and the 2x2. Apple bought NeXT in the late 1990s and brought Jobs back. He was older, calmer, still intense. The company he returned to had brilliant people but too many products. Here's where the quiet decision begins. Jobs killed complexity. He sketched a 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. Consumer and pro on one axis, desktop and portable on the other. 4 squares, 4 products. Anything that didn't fit was noise. It's easy to miss how radical that is. Most companies respond to trouble by shipping more SKUs, not fewer. Apple did the opposite. They got out of their own way. Then came the iMac in 1998, a translucent bubble that said computers didn't need to be beige or boring. It plugged in, got online, and looked like somebody finally asked a designer how a computer should make a person feel. The message behind the plastic was louder than the case itself. Apple would compete by making complexity feel like clarity and by making clarity feel like joy. Leadership handoff and the services flywheel. When Tim Cook became CEO in 2011, the storyline many people predicted was operations guy maintains momentum. What happened was more interesting. Apple scaled. Supply chains that would make most companies faint on a whiteboard became routine. The App Store, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus, iCloud, and a wallet full of services turned devices into memberships. The goal wasn't to trap users, it was to reward them for staying. When your photos, messages, purchases, and playlists glide across your devices, loyalty stops being a promise and becomes a convenience. Here's where I plant a flag. Apple's biggest competitive advantage isn't a single chip, camera, or screen. It's taste, enforced at scale. Taste is knowing what to leave out. It's why a menu stays short even when the kitchen could cook 100 dishes. It's why a product line can look simple from the outside while 1,000 engineers wrestle complexity into silence behind the scenes. Rivalries, copycats, and why Apple doesn't flinch. Across the decades, Apple has faced rivals with bigger market share, lower prices, or wilder specs. The temptation is to sprint after every trend, prove you can do everything, and risk doing nothing memorable. Apple's refusal to chase every number on the spec sheet is not stubbornness, it's positioning. Yes, Apple borrows great ideas when the time is right. Yes, competitors borrow from Apple when the time is right for them. But the company's signature move is patience married to precision. Wait until the tech is ready for a mass audience, then deliver the version that feels finished. Misunderstood moments that deserve a second look. Some of Apple's most controversial decisions age better than expected. Removing floppy drives and later the headphone jack wasn't about picking fights. It was about moving weight from yesterday's expectations to tomorrow's design. The transitions to new chip architectures from PowerPC to Intel to Apple's own silicon weren't just engineering flexes. They were bets that control over the stack yields years of compounding benefits for performance, battery life, and heat. When you own the pieces, you can choreograph the dance. A quick smile before we land the plane. If early-ear Apple was a garage band, modern Apple is a symphony that rehearses for months so the first note feels effortless. And yes, sometimes the critics show up with decibel meters and insist it's not rock and roll anymore. Fair. But when your watch taps you to stand, and you avoid an afternoon slump, or your phone unlocks with a glance while you're balancing groceries and dignity in a parking lot, you remember that usefulness can be its own kind of music. The open-loop payoff. The decision in 1997. So what was the quiet decision that saved Apple? Focus. Brutal, public, math on a whiteboard focus. That 2x2 grid that reduced the entire product strategy to 4 boxes forced Apple to stop trying to be everything to everyone and start being essential to someone. It's not a line you can put on a billboard, but it's the reason those later billboards mattered. Then, Apple layered a second decision. Make the NeXT software DNA the foundation of its future. That meant building a modern operating system and development environment that would let the company move faster for decades. A product line you can explain in a sentence, and a software core you can evolve for a generation. That combination is the hinge the whole comeback swings on. Lessons and why they still matter. Apple's origin is a familiar startup parable, but the rise is not an accident, and the endurance is not a coincidence. The company built habits instead of only hardware. It kept the promise of simplicity even as the world got complex. It chose taste over variety and systems over stunts. And it revisits first principles. What problem are we solving for the person on the other side of the screen? Every time the industry tries to distract it with louder numbers and cheaper alternatives. What's next? Next up, we'll unpack the friendliest rivalry in tech's ruthless league. The one where Apple and Microsoft alternated between courtroom opponents, unlikely partners, and quiet codependents. Subscribe so it lands on your home feed the second it drops. And keep that 2x2 grid in mind. Once you see it, you start noticing which companies have the courage to pick the right 4 squares and which ones drown in their own catalogs.